remains true presents Noble Heart, a self-guided retreat on befriending your obstacles with Pema Chodron. Ordained in 1974 as a Tibetan Buddhist nun, Pema Chodron is the director of Gampo Abbey in Nova Scotia, Canada, and is an acharya, or master teacher, in the lineage of Tibetan meditation master Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who founded the Shambhala International Organization. Recorded over the course of a 10-day meditation retreat, Noble Heart presents Pema Chodron's central teachings on the Buddhist view and practice of bodhicitta, which literally means awakened heart. The awakened heart is courageous, open, fearless, and compassionate. It is noble because it recognizes that there are no real barriers between us, and that its own happiness is inseparable from the happiness of all beings. Noble Heart combines teachings with meditation instruction and is designed to be used as a self-guided retreat. Please refer to the booklet that accompanies this audio series for instructions on how best to use these audio programs in a retreat setting. And now, Session 1 of Noble Heart, the practice of bodhicitta with Pema Chodron.
So in keeping with the nature of this program, I'd like to begin with an aspiration. And that is a very heartfelt wish that we all benefit a lot from this teaching, all of us without exception, that it changes something in us for the better. And whatever benefit we have received, that it spreads to the people that we meet and talk with. And so that any goodness that we experience here, and any opening of our heart or mind that we experience here, that spreads out and really benefits everyone that we meet. And then from them it can spread to others and could go a very long way. So what I will be presenting during our time together is the practice of bodhicitta, which can be called the continual practice of bodhicitta, which is to say that this practice can be with you no matter what you're doing. It's said traditionally that just as alchemy can turn any metal into gold, in the same way, bodhicitta practice can change any action, any word, any thought into the path of awakening. Bodhicitta, it's a Sanskrit word, and the citta, C-I-T-T-A, this word means heart, and it also means mind. So sometimes they say heart, mind, just like one thing. And there's a lot of translations of the word bodhicitta. One of them is awakened heart. Another is enlightened mind. But it's basically pointing at completely relaxed, unlimited, and at the same time extremely kind heart and mind. And if you were to ask the Buddhist on the street, say, sir, ma'am, what is bodhicitta? I think the first thing that people think of who have heard about this at all before would say that it's the wish for all of us to be happy and to find out what is the cause of happiness. So that it's not just like, may we have a nice dinner tonight, but really a kind of indestructible happiness that stays with you through the ups and downs, the vicissitudes of life. So I think most people would say it's this heartfelt wish that we all be happy and free of suffering, that we grow in understanding about the cause of suffering and the cause of happiness, that we sort of get smart on this subject. So it's that strong wish. And others might say, well, it's the strong wish that we recognize the true nature of our mind, that we actually recognize this limitless quality of our being so that we can help people in a really profound way. Someone said to me recently, they were working with a therapist who had done a lot of Buddhist meditation. And they said what really struck them about him was that he didn't seem to have a lot of vested interest in his own identity, that they always felt a lot of space, that he wasn't always putting himself out, that there just seemed to be a lot of space there. And he said, because of that, I'm able to let go of my own fixed ideas about myself and connect with something much more open and fresh and healing. And in a sense, that's the aspiration. You know, when we're suffering a lot, here we are, all of us have suffered, and many of us might be suffering a lot right now, or at least come from a situation, a sort of ongoing, painful situation that you experience. And it's quite natural when one experiences physical and mental suffering that you start looking for answers of how to stop hurting, right? So there's this little shift, which is that you realize that one of the most important ingredients in stopping hurting is to begin to look out and start to learn how to love and how to share that love. Really begin to realize how completely interconnected we all are, and that it's by that interconnection, that connection with other people, is what really will heal our pain. And so there begins to be this shift of beginning to experiment with finding out whether that's true, beginning to think about others and develop this sense of love for all beings, oneself and others, and see whether it's true that, they say, stretching the heart and stretching the mind, beginning to reach out, beginning to experiment. Is it true that actually that's much more healing than just to continue to sort of trying to get to the root of your problem and kind of going around and around just with self? So the shift that occurs is that you begin to wish that you could stop hurting so that you could help other people. And you realize that to the degree that you are afraid, and mostly to the degree that we are uptight, to that degree we can't even see other people's faces or hear their words because everything is so inward. We know that experience. As somebody said, it's so ironic that so many of us have a deep disrespect and even loathing for ourselves, and yet all we ever think about is ourselves. Seems like the more we're hurting, the more we can't look out. And so these practices that we'll be doing and these teachings that we'll be receiving are like hints and supports for looking out, making that shift as a way of stopping hurting so that we can be there for other people. Realize that we are tremendously important to each other and that we are completely interdependent. So bodhicitta, it means that, which I've just described. So first I'd like to give an overview of what we will be receiving. I will be presenting the view of bodhicitta, like the point of view, the attitude, the teachings that go along with this practice. It's almost like the atmosphere, presenting the atmosphere or environment that inspires you and encourages us while we practice. And then we will be doing a lot of sitting meditation, shamatha vipassana practice, also called mindfulness awareness practice. And when we do the shamatha vipassana sitting practice, which I will be giving you instruction on this practice in some detail, it is cultivating a lot of things. But one of the things is to begin to see the transparency of our thoughts and come to know the nature of our mind. We will also be practicing a lot of the heart practices of loving kindness or unlimited friendliness, practices of compassion and joy, as well as the practice of equanimity. And these practices will be taught in a rather traditional way as aspiring practices. And when I began the talk, I made such an aspiration for all of us, an aspiration based on wanting all of us to connect with a kind of deep, unshakable happiness and be free from suffering and causes of suffering, and the wish that that happiness and that freedom from suffering could spread. And so this is what I mean by aspiration. We'll be working with these. I'll be giving you some traditional ones and also encouraging you to make it genuine and real for yourself. So these aspiring practices, I'll be giving teachings on these and giving you the practices. As they say, with these practices, wherever you go, there they are. And that's what's good about them. I will be also giving the practice of Tonglen, which is a practice of unlimited friendliness and compassion. And finally, I will be giving the practices of the 6 paramitas, which are how you take what you're practicing into all the activities of your life. Primarily, the paramitas are what they call post-meditation practice, which means your whole life when you're not formally practicing, which is a lot of time. So these practices of the paramitas, I'm going to be giving you teachings and instructions on these. So now I'd like to give a very basic teaching as a sort of introduction into the continual practice of bodhicitta. And this is the teaching on the 3 marks of existence. If you've heard this teaching before, you may not recognize it the way I teach it. So these 3 marks of existence, like the 3 characteristics of human existence or of existence of all living conscious beings. According to the Buddhist teachings, the 3 characteristics are, the first is impermanence, and the second is egolessness, and the third is suffering or dissatisfaction. So this first one, impermanence, this is a recognition which begins to dawn on us more and more that things are in process, that things are not static or fixed. And when I say things, I mean everything, every tree, every blade of grass, all the animals, insects, human beings, buildings, the animate and the inanimate. Everything is always changing. I was reading something of Thich Nhat Hanh's on this subject just yesterday, and he says, you can't really say that A is A. He says, because by the time you've even said A, it's already different. So you can't say that it's B either, because it's just like always changing. Contemplative people and mystics throughout all of history have realized this. And recently, scientists are realizing this as well. We're always in transition. I remember one time I was complaining to my teacher, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, that I was having so much trouble with transitions. I think I was changing jobs and houses and everything all at once, and I was feeling so insecure and uncertain and groundless, and I was complaining that I had a lot of trouble with transition. I suppose I said this to him thinking that he would say something that would help me to work with transitions. He looked at me sort of blankly and said, "We are always in transition." And then I think he said, "If you could just relax with that, you'd have no problems at all." So it's interesting, we know that things are impermanent. We know that things wear out. But the point is that emotionally, we never can accept it. Skipping ahead to suffering, that's where the suffering comes from, that emotionally, even if conceptually we can buy it, emotionally we can't. So impermanence is experienced at the everyday level as a frustration for us because we're so geared to static thinking. We're so geared to seeking for certainty and for security. And if you don't believe that, just try to live 15 minutes without feeling like you have some idea of what's going on. So in some sense, you could say with this mark of impermanence that it doesn't mean that we never know what's going on. We can cook a meal, we can raise children and have relationships and balance the books and all these things. But the fact is that if we're doing those things to try to deny that things are fundamentally very unpredictable and that fundamentally everything is extremely ambiguous and paradoxical and uncertain. And the Buddhist teachings are training in beginning to relax with that. Again, Thich Nhat Hanh said, well, if you really think about it, if things weren't impermanent, it would mean that nothing ever grew. It would mean that there was no possibility of newness or freshness. But emotionally, we actually really wish that it could sort of just be dependable and stay still. The Buddhist teachings are taught to set us free from this limited way of thinking about things and this limited way of emotionally relating with our world. To set us free rather than, just put us in another cage, just move us out of the uncomfortable cage into a comfortable cage or something like that. When we really look at it and think about it, if we're really honest with ourselves, sometimes we actually prefer to be in a cage. So the second mark of existence is egolessness, which is really saying the same thing at the personal level, that we also are impermanent. And it doesn't just mean that we die. It also means that this identity that we hold to so strongly and that we walk around with all the time is all made up. It's just all made up. We kind of cling to this idea of who we are, and it's pretty crippling to us. Of course, this idea shifts around a little bit depending on who we're talking to and what we're doing, whether we have an idea that we're pretty together or we're pretty hopeless. But there is this identity that we carry around with us. And this teaching on egolessness is basically pointing out that we would be much happier and there would be the cessation of suffering if we weren't clinging so hard to this very limited and limiting identity of who we think we are and who we put a lot of energy into continuing to be. So there's no room for magic, very little room for surprise and adventure and creativity, and just connecting with the much more limitless quality of our heart and our mind. So if you've read any Buddhist books or heard any Buddhist teachings, you've heard about ego, which gets a lot of bad press. Ego being this sort of identity, I guess, this limited identity. And it's helpful actually in talking about this subject, which is, fundamental way of looking at things from a Buddhist perspective. It helps a lot to realize that when we look at all the people and all the creatures in the world, we can look at them in terms of there's this limited, small mind, which is always thinking and planning and scheming and very uncomfortable with uncertainty. But it's always contrasted to this whole other quality, which might be called big mind or egolessness. Or there's one translation where the kind of caught up part of us is called fictitious being, and the uncaught up, open part of our being is called true being or true nature. So there are always like two ways of thinking about things. And in Tibetan, there's a lot of words for mind, but two very useful ones are sem, S-E-M-S, which is this small mind that's always caught up. And the main quality of this small mind that we all have is that it concretizes. It wants to fix things. It wants to say, it's like this. One of the other words for mind in Tibetan is rigpa, and that's the big mind, the wisdom mind, the open mind, which also we all experience. We experience it as inspiration. We experience it as insight. Maybe we're all caught up, and for some reason or other, we can just let go of our trip, of our misery or our grudge or whatever it is, a sort of a lightening up. So there's this way of talking about things, and it's said that the whole path is about coming to know the nature of mind. And you could say that the whole path of bodhicitta practice is coming to know the nature of this heart mind. The good news is that this means getting to know this closed mind, this fearful mind, this limited mind, this small mind. It's just as important to get to know that as it is to get to know vast mind, limitless mind, the mind of Rigpa. Well, that's very good news, since that's mostly what we know. And when we meditate, we spend hours and hours with the yakety-yak mind. But the powerful thing is that it's by getting to know the ego or the small mind, and that it's actually by getting to know it completely, becoming intimate with it. Trungpa Rinpoche used to say, making friends with it. Making friends with that part of ourself. It's by doing that the limitless quality of our being, that we begin to connect with the Rigpa nature of our mind, the open mind, So it could be said that the whole spiritual path, that it's going from narrow mind to open mind. That's a kind of really simple way to think about it. That the difference between a fully awakened being and a confused being is the difference between a narrow mind and an open mind. And actually that's the bodhicitta practice, is just acknowledging exactly where we are, seeing that we have both these things, the narrow mind and the open mind, and beginning to make the journey of going from extremely limited and extremely narrow to gradually more and more open. Now, when you say open mind, complete open mind, that's a description of full awakening. That's a description of going a long way, enlightened being. So for that reason, I think personally, one should take heart and feel encouraged that we're not talking about that we have to understand right away or even soon the limitless quality of our being. The whole path is one of realizing that there is this spark. In each of us, there's this spark. And the path is one of gradually letting that spark grow more and more until it's a flame, blazing flame. And the bodhicitta practice is especially works with connecting with the tenderness that we experience. Connecting with the, Trungpa Rinpoche used to call it soft spot that we feel, that can be extremely tiny. It doesn't matter how small it is. It has the potential of becoming very vast. Actually, the most helpful way to think about it is that it already is extremely vast. We grow in awareness of who we really are. So it should be pointed out right now that this ego is not something that we try to get rid of or destroy. It's more a path of getting to know it so well that actually we begin to see through it. Begin to see that it actually has no hold on us. Seeing through it. And the process of seeing through it is making friends. This applying unlimited friendliness to all of our words and all of our actions and all of our thoughts. So ego's not like sin. Ego is just a kind of a description of a misunderstanding. Another way it's described is just a slight going astray, but has disastrous results. And actually one of my favorite ways that it's described is that the more awake we are, the more open the mind is. Everything is much more vibrant. The energy is flowing. There's a sense of human beings being much more like a river than like a thing. Sense of being extremely fluid, and that all that ego is just kind of more dense. A kind of a more closed down, more dense. And it's just a misunderstanding about who we really are. So I guess maybe by this time it's already clear about the suffering part. That the third mark of existence is suffering, and very simply said, it's that because we're so geared, not just you and me, not just us, but the whole species, we're kind of born like this. It's kind of part of what it means to be human, is it's kind of in the genetic structure, it's in the DNA, that we're geared towards static thinking. We're geared towards being very uncomfortable with uncertainty. So you could say that these practices that we'll be doing, the bodhicitta practices, are practices that cause evolution to be able to happen, letting the evolution of consciousness happen, letting the evolution of the heart happen. letting it happen, so that when we go from narrow to open, there actually begins to be a kind of a fundamental shift in this misunderstanding. So this truth of suffering, or this mark of existence, which about suffering, is basically just saying reality is wide open. Reality is, as I was saying, like a river. It's flowing. It's always changing. This is actually a wonderful thing. Egolessness, when you begin to connect with it more and more, it feels like all the restrictions are gone. And like putting down an enormous burden of weight and stress and struggle and anxiety. That the true state of things, it's not all that mystical or far away or anything. It's just that the true nature of energy is that it moves, and we're made of it, and everything's made of it. But the human species doesn't seem to get that very simple point. Therefore, all the world religions, all the everything, just to try to help us get that point so that we could relax, deeply relax. If we were fully open and awake, we wouldn't call it uncertainty. We would just call it life. This life, this good life. That we, just like everything, it's a seed, it grows, it blossoms, it's a flower, its time passes, it returns to the earth. There's just this whole thing, but you know that emotionally, this is a big threat. And everything we do, our whole life is geared towards trying to prevent that from happening. Intellectually, you would say, no, that's not true, but emotionally, it is true. And that's what's called suffering. So fortunately, a lot of good people have practiced very hard and realized this completely. And because of the hard work of many men and women over the centuries, these teachings are still very alive. We can benefit from them today, and hopefully they stay alive and people can benefit from them forever. But nobody in the future will benefit unless people like ourselves begin to give it a try. You know, in other words, where does it get passed on? It gets passed on as a living, breathing, real tradition. It gets passed on as actions and words and thoughts and just how we live our lives, not as philosophies. You know, we could read philosophies forever, but basically it would just die, because if there's no people doing it, it isn't life. It isn't alive. So those are the three marks of existence, and the whole Buddhist path, or actually many paths, are based on that we can spend our lives, I guess you could say that generally until we begin to be introduced to this idea and to begin to contemplate it and practice it, we spend our lives just getting more and more fixed. So how do we spend our lives? Do we spend our lives getting more and more, fixed and solid and narrow? Or do we spend our lives aspiring to open and change and, relax with uncertainty? Relax deeply, body and mind, relax completely, deeply. Body, mind, heart, everything. So I'd like to end by giving you the first practice. And this is the practice of the three noble principles. I'm going to tell you about it now, and then we're going to be working with it a lot during our time together. When I first heard about these three noble principles, which is a long time ago, actually when I heard about a lot of these teachings, I had a lot of resistance because it felt like I was pretending, it felt contrived, it felt phony. I don't know why I stuck with it. I think because I had a lot of encouragement to just make it real, make it genuine. If it feels too phony, just kind of work with it a little so it feels right to you. I had a lot of encouragement that way. And actually, I don't remember any teacher ever saying, do it my way or else. There's no way to become open unless you follow my instructions and stick to them just the way I say, to the letter of the law. If you veer from these instructions, hopeless for you, doomed. So obviously it's not like that. So here's these 3 noble principles. They're called good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good at the end. Good in the middle is how I began this talk today. And this is getting in the habit of when you begin your day, or if it occurs to you when you're beginning an activity, like when you first get to work, or maybe beginning to prepare a meal, or whenever it occurs to you, at the beginning of something, you purposely create an atmosphere of compassion, such as making the wish that whatever I'm going to do here, may it help me, may it help everybody. If there's any goodness that comes from this, that people enjoy the meal, or that I'm a little less uptight by the end of the day, or that I say a kind word, or that I catch myself spinning off into negativity, or anything, some aspiration at the beginning of compassion, of kindness, of wanting it to be of benefit, of wanting yourself and others that this should increase as many people's happiness as possible and reduce as many people's suffering as possible. And it's just fine to include yourself in this equation. In fact, it's pretty essential that you do that. So that's good at the beginning. It's like creating an environment of compassion. And then you just go forward. And then there's the middle, and then there's the end. And I'll talk about the middle, but the end is sharing the merit, which I'll be saying more about. But one time I said to Trungpa Rinpoche, I said, Rinpoche, I just don't get it. I said, at the end of my meal, I say, by this merit, may all attain omniscience, and may it remove wrongdoing from the stormy waves of birth, old age, and death. May we free all beings. I say, I don't get it. I ate the meal completely mindlessly. I didn't think of another person at all when I was eating. I just had total discursive thought. There was no mindfulness. There was no Maitri. In fact, I had a lot of resentful thoughts and worries, and I was stressed out. And I said, what's the merit? What am I sharing here? And he said, if you offer it at the beginning, even if you forget all about it through the whole thing, he said, just the fact that you offered it at the beginning, that there was some intention that this should be of benefit. And then there's something to share at the end. So I was glad to hear that. So good in the middle is to do what you do with an attitude of not grasping. And this is not easy. But it's sort of helpful to have it pointed out that you could at least take this attitude of not grasping. What does this mean? Well, it's actually the whole description of how we go from being very narrow to how we go to be open. It's the description of the whole path, is training in not holding so tight. And a lot of it is just beginning to catch ourselves, when we harden into resentment, when we start worrying, when we real negative words coming out of our mouths, where we hear ourselves either complaining or gossiping about someone, putting someone down. It's endless, right, what we do. So part of training in non-grasping is basically catching yourself, getting narrow, and then just letting go, not actually beating yourself up about that. Someone said the way they train is they catch themselves, they forgive themselves, and then they just go on. Next moment. You see, that's the whole idea of this impermanence and egolessness. It's that it's always the next moment. No matter how badly you blew it just now or in the past, it's a new moment now. You can feel the regret and just move on, You don't have to carry it around your neck like a dead cat. So good in the middle is training in the non-grasping attitude. And good at the end is that when the activity is finished, like at the end of your day, just before you go to sleep, or when you leave at the end of work, or when you finish the meal, or whatever it is, it might occur to you, even if you forgot to offer it in the beginning, and you forgot to catch yourself grasping in the middle, you could still remember at the end and say, anything good that happened here, let it spread out. And actually, anything negative or narrow that happened here, you can say, may we all be free of this. That kind of suffering. That kind of suffering that comes from resentment, that comes from anger, that, we have all these qualities. We can't just snap our fingers and they're gone. So maybe at the end of the day, there's a lot of embarrassment, not to mention like shame and regret and a lot of stuff. And you can just say, that's how it went. May we all just see what we do and forgive ourselves and go on. May we all be free of hurting ourselves. Basically, all that's happening there, even though it does have pretty disastrous consequences, all that's happening is a slight misunderstanding about the true nature of reality, not understanding the impermanent, egoless, fluid, open-ended flux of things. Therefore, we have a very ancient habit. The whole species has this habit of narrowing down. And the good news is that we can turn that around with our actions, our words, and our thoughts. And we don't have to be in a hurry. The good news is actually that if we're in a hurry, it will just a backlash on us. Just let it happen at its own speed. But we do our best to sow these seeds of opening the mind and the heart. So I have a homework assignment for you. This homework assignment is to help you with the practices that we'll be doing. So I would like it if you would start today to make 2 lists. Actually write them down. It helps to actually write it down. Make a list, one of people you feel grateful to, or situations that you're grateful for. Anything that when you think about it, there's a feeling of gratitude or appreciation. Sometimes when you start to make these lists, you can't think of anyone. But then maybe that very day somebody does something and you can put them on the list. And the other list is of anybody or anything that when you think of it, you automatically, right now, already feel compassion. And generally speaking, what happens with this, and this is what happens with bodhicitta altogether, is that definitely it has been my experience that went on for many years, was that when I was supposed to do these practices, I would feel more frozen than usual. It was just some kind of like closing down that would happen. But I feel so inspired to teach these practices because what I found and what so many people have shared with me is that just by turning your mind towards, for instance, these 2 lists, turning your mind towards gratitude where you already feel some gratitude, turning your mind towards where you already feel some compassion, just by beginning to notice and heighten a bit or put the spotlight on these feelings of the heart, something begins to melt. Some hardness begins to melt. And this has been my experience, whereas before I felt so frozen, gradually over time, now my list is so long that you would laugh if you were to see it, and I'm always adding to it. And when I do these practices, there's like a floodgates open, thinking of people that I wish could be happy and understand the root of happiness and would be free of suffering. But it wasn't like that in the beginning, and it wasn't like that for a long time. So it starts, as I said, like a little spark, and then rather than the spark just going out, there's some sense of beginning to blaze. It's also often described as a seed, and that it needs the warmth of purposely cultivating on the heart practices for this a seed to begin to blossom into a flower. So I would like to end by sharing the merit. I think I'll just do a kind of a spontaneous one, and I do this on purpose to give you the feeling that, you can do that too. So the notion of sharing the merit is simply that I'd like to express a very heartfelt wish that the virtue or the goodness of all of you listening to the teachings and the teachings being taught, the possibility of even beginning to contemplate that we could develop a trust in our basic goodness and could begin to develop a flexible mind and heart, that not be limited just to us, and that could spread throughout the whole universe even. So that any goodness or any insight, any inspiration that we had, that it could spread a long way.
This concludes Session 1 of Noble Heart.